All right. So today I'm going to do the first in what I think will be a series, maybe the next 2 weeks get us to the end of the year of kind of an end of the year synthetic uh, series on the Trump presidency. And obviously we're only less than 1 year into the second term, and it's an interrupted presidency, right? Not two consecutive terms, but two terms interrupted by one term with Joe Biden. But having said that, I have on the board images that I think reflect the transition that appears to be setting in. And I will be clear, this is a little speculative. I'm going to entertain the hypothesis that for Donald Trump, this was the do-over presidency, right? In his first term, he was mainly thwarted in implementing his agenda, and he came to conclude that that was because he surrounded himself for too much of that first term with mainstream Republicans in his cabinet who took it as their mission to guide him away from some of his impulses, his instincts, his most radical ideas, to force him to conform to the culture, the norms, the expectations of the modern presidency, as well as the policy horizons of conventional policy. And having said all that, right? So Donald Trump removed many of those impediments to his really imposing his will on his second term and his policy priorities really being implemented via executive action. One of the images I have on the board here is Donald Trump in his first day of his second term issuing a whole slew of executive orders, including one, right, suspending or overturning birthright citizenship for people born in this country who met certain criteria. This was an indication of, I think, the radicalness, then the kind of flood the zone strategy of Donald Trump's second term. He was going to rapidly try to accomplish everything he felt thwarted in his incapacity to do in his first term. So a do-over presidency that is now effectively over in the sense that to the degree that Donald Trump relied on that flood the zone strategy, action that is radical, that occurs so rapidly, the volume of which is so high. I think it's over 40 executive actions in that first day in office, that institutions that might resist are paralyzed or distracted or diffuse in their efforts, and so they don't have time to keep up with the action of this administration, and that this right strategy has now played out, and that one of the consequences of the way in which it has been conducted is that Donald Trump now leaves the first year, concludes the first year of his presidency deeply unpopular. And right, Donald Trump has never been a particularly popular president, but he entered his second term with a level of support that it was a clear but slender majority of Americans. He now ends that first year with a substantial majority of Americans disapproving of his conduct, and it doesn't appear that there's much that he's going to be able to do to turn that around. That's the hypothesis I'm entertaining. What does this do to Donald Trump? He loses his capacity to bully, to overwhelm through sheer force of will, through ruthlessness, through speed, through the radicalness of his action, to bring American institutions that might otherwise resist to do his will, or at least to get out of the way. And I have on the board a second image to contrast the beginning of the first year with the end of the first year. Not all the way there, right? Still a month away, but it seems to me that this is a pretty good bookend for that first year. The vote a couple days ago in Indiana, right? And this is on the part of the Republican Party in Indiana to resist the redistricting coercion coming out of Washington, D.C. And I'm using that phrase advisedly. On the one hand, I think it's very clear that this was a very high priority for the Trump administration, right? J.D. Vance, the vice president, went to Indiana several times to pursue this. The leaders of the Indiana Republican Party and legislature were brought to the White House for Donald Trump to personally lobby them. And right, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, is on the phone for hours trying to convince the undecided members of the Indiana legislature to vote for the president's plan. And in the end, it loses decisively because a plurality of Republicans joined with the unanimous Democrats to block the effort to carve out two more seats for Republicans in Indiana. And I do want to say there's probably some prudence in this vote, that if you redistribute and spread the Republicans of Indiana out a little bit more thinly across districts, and it's a big blue wave election in 2026, then the consequence of the redistricting could backfire. We'll have to see. There's some possibility this will happen, for instance, in South Texas. But I would add that in addition to the prudential concern, is this really just a good thing from a strategic Republican perspective to do? There is a principled rejection of the idea that the state legislature should just do the will of the national president because he threatens them if they don't do his will, because he coerces them. And so some ideas rooted in federalism, rooted in the idea that the states are independent from the national government and the national party. And Indiana is not just going to do this because Donald Trump tells them to do it. And then please know, really strong arm and threatening tactics, sending implicit threats of violence against the members of the legislature. I'm not saying Donald Trump did this, but people within the MAGA movement did this, as they're prone to do. And so the Indiana legislature also said, we're just not going to be bullied and intimidated. We're going to stand up to those kinds of tactics. I also have on the board a few more images to try to bring this transition that I'm describing more clearly into focus. So Donald Trump, first day in office, looking relatively rested, relatively healthy, relatively effective and serious. Donald Trump last week getting a Peace Prize from the international governing body of football, or as we like to say, soccer. First time ever FIFA has given a Peace Prize, right? And the idea that the President of the United States would celebrate getting a Peace Prize from a football federation, right? You want to laugh out loud, but there he is on stage wearing the medallion, holding the trophy, apparently pleased as can be that he's finally getting his Peace Prize. Meanwhile, there's a scandal playing out in Washington, D.C. around congressional investigations into the president and his administration ordering the murder of helpless civilians who are in a capsized boat in the Caribbean, right? And I'll just make it very clear, right? The person who's dogged by that kind of scandal would not win a genuine Peace Prize. And the idea that his vanity, his weakness, his disconnection from reality. And by the way, if you look at the contrast in the images, the way in which he appears to have been worn down by his first year in the presidency, 8 years older than he was last time that he did it, also seems to be apparent on stage. One more way in which Donald Trump's grip on the Republican Party seems clearly to have weakened over the course of his first year in office is reflected by the vote on the Epstein files, the near unanimity of Congress in ordering that those files be disclosed. And as we've seen in court proceedings this week, it does appear that some of the material that has been collected in the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein and the people surrounding him will begin to make its way to public. We'll have to see how redacted it is, how revelatory it is, whether or not there's any stuff that further damages Donald Trump in it. But having said that, I think that the damage may already have been done by Donald Trump, first of all, resisting the release of these files and using his administration to stonewall what they had pledged to do in the campaign. It makes Donald Trump look like another ordinary, unaccountable American politician. And please note that there's a kind of almost savior complex that some of his supporters have had. He'll be the first president who genuinely stands up for us as opposed to just serving the elite masters who got them his office. And that aura, I think, is fading very rapidly from Donald Trump, and the fact that he couldn't protect the Epstein files, but also the fact that he tried so hard to prevent their disclosure is also taking the luster and diminishing the power of Donald Trump in his now second year in office. And then finally, in ways that I've spoken with you about recently, the idea that Donald Trump has used violence instead of power, that he's relied on coercion and bullying and the naked use of the instruments of state power, especially in the way in which ICE and Border Patrol have been unleashed in the deportation campaign, seems to have driven his approval, especially with Latino voters, who are now basically 1 in 5 Americans, down dramatically, but I want to say with many Americans. And the idea, as we discussed several weeks ago with Hannah Arendt's distinction between power and violence, that power requires persuasion. It requires forming shared ideas. Violence doesn't require that. It merely requires having instruments that can harm people's bodies to get them out of fear to do what you want them to do. And that Donald Trump's reliance on fear and violence rather than power and persuasion is going to be diminished going forward. Not saying that ICE and Border Patrol won't continue to do terrible things in American cities, but that as the legitimacy, as the perceived mandate that Donald Trump has in the American electorate fades, we're going to see Donald Trump's capacity to control other institutions, to control the narrative surrounding his presidency, fade as well. And so what I want to do is to try to frame with you a series of questions and then a few answers today, or at least a few speculations about how to answer these questions, assuming that Donald Trump will be president for the next 3 years, but assuming also that he will be much less popular, much less capable of using unilateral power, and that up until this point in his career and his life, especially as a politician, he has not developed any alternative repertoire of instruments to govern with. What will this mean? Not for Donald Trump, I'm not really terribly concerned about his welfare or his standing as a president, but for the country, given that he will remain in the White House and no doubt be thwarted and angry and seething and looking for new ways to reassert his power, right? So the first question, I've got a long series of questions here, bear with me. Can a president whose entire career has featured disinhibition and norm breaking, right? This is the man who entered the political scene by publishing a full page ad in the New York Times calling for the execution of the Central Park Five people who turned out to be innocent, right? But who was grabbing attention by behaving or offering opinions that were clearly transgressive. This is the way in which Donald Trump has operated throughout his life, and the big gold branding of everything as Trump, is indicative of a man who wants to be seen, wants to grab attention, and wants to do so by being perceived as powerful. He's surrounded now by an administration built to enable him. Right. And this is the idea of the do-over presidency, that in his first term, in order to bolster his credibility, to reassure markets and reassure institutions, he brought in all these mainstream Republicans. They essentially steered him in directions he didn't want to be steered. And now he's built a second administration to enable him. If the first administration was filled with mainstream Republicans and adults in the room, the second administration is filled with bobbleheads, people who rush to be the first to compliment the genius of Donald Trump and to attempt to do what they anticipate or think he wants them to do better and faster than anybody else in the cabinet. And he is clearly trying to use this new cabinet to fulfill the thwarted priorities and wishes of his first term. Let's assume that his capacity to do this is fading quickly. Will he develop late in life new capacities to compromise and increased realism and discipline? And my answer to this question, I suppose, is very straightforward. I'm going to assume that he won't. And I'm going to assume that he won't because he is about to enter, his ninth decade of life, and it just doesn't seem very likely, given who he is, that he's going to develop the flexibility. And by the way, if he does, it will be changing his brand, as I think he would put it, in a deep way, and that he does not believe that brands should be changed, so much as doubled down on. So assuming he's not going to become more of a consensus politician who works within the institutional constraints, will a president who remains committed to unilateral domination, to producing subordination in order to impose his will on institutions in a way that the institution, the office he occupies, does not really permit him to do, and has not been done for a very long time in American politics? Will this man who desires domination be able to deal with resistance, the resistance that will start within the party, and here the fact that Republicans are in control of both houses of Congress, have a majority in the Supreme Court in terms of Republican appointed justices, has allowed Donald Trump in many ways to impose his will on other institutions of government by imposing his will through his party on the members of those institutions. If he loses his partisan dominance, he probably loses his cross institutional dominance. The Supreme Court and Congress start to function independently of Donald Trump. I'll have more to say about the Supreme Court as we get further into this, but the idea that the result will be that he's going to have to work with those institutions to get anything done is a fundamental turn away from the modus operandi of the first term. I'm sorry, the first year of Donald Trump's second term. And so the idea that Donald Trump's success depends less on his own actions, right, and more on the submission of formally independent centers of power, right? And we're going to see this in the coming weeks and months. The idea that the new Affordable Care Act premiums, with the Biden era subsidies removed, are now going to stay in place, right? We had votes in the Senate a couple days ago, and they were not able to hammer anything out, and so 10 to 20 million Americans are going to be spending $1,000 or more a year. Probably 10 million Americans are going to lose health insurance as a result. And the idea that the Senate, maybe Congress as a whole, if it had been acting a little bit more independently from Donald Trump, might have deliberated about that provision and said, well, wait a sec, we don't like the Affordable Care Act. The Republican Party has made its objective for a long time, especially the Make America Great Again wing of the Republican Party, to dismantle Obamacare. But if we do this without replacing it with anything, if we do it in a moment when Americans are struggling with 4 years of sustained inflation that has increased prices for most goods by over 20% over that 4-year period, right? If we now make healthcare insurance a fair bit more expensive, and I've just been reading one of the Kaiser Foundation reports, KFF reports, that says, and it's just stunning, right, that the average premium for a family of 4 who gets employer provided private insurance or health insurance in the United States in 2025, the average premium is $27,000 per year. Now, employers provide usually 2/3 to 3/4 of, or cover 2/3 to 3/4 of that expense. The employee covers the remaining third or quarter, plus the deductibles and copays. But having said that, the idea that, the employer is spending $20,000 a year for their employees' healthcare insurance means that they don't have that money to increase wages to keep up with the cost of living. The fact that the employee is paying the remaining quarter or third means that they are struggling to make rent or mortgage or pay for food or other expenses, transportation, education, etc. And so the idea that this might have been an issue if the Republicans had not just rushed the One Big Beautiful Bill through because Donald Trump told them to, I think illustrates, how much the submission of Congress to Trump's power, the seeming subservience of the Supreme Court of the United States on issues that seem to be obviously in their wheelhouse, part of their jurisdiction and mandate, that they have, through the emergency docket again and again and again and again, just told the lower courts to get out of the way of Donald Trump. That this is the secret of his success in his first term. Not so secret, I guess. And it appears that it may be eroding. So how will Donald Trump govern in a world in which the institutional architecture of the Constitution starts to kick in again? Third, can autocratic ambitions, right? The idea I'm going to take seriously is that Donald Trump is trying to dramatically strengthen the presidency in order to make the presidency the chief initiator of political action in the United States. And I want to be as clear as possible, right? The architects of our Constitution did not think of the presidency as a initiator of legislative action. They really very clearly assigned all of that authority to Congress. The president is supposed to bring energy to the execution of the laws, but the idea that the president will use executive action to stand in for Congress when Congress is paralyzed, or when the inertia of the slow process of legislating, given the institutional structure of the United States, means that it's not responding quickly enough or decisively enough to the challenges facing the American people. This is the model, right, that Donald Trump has embraced. Look at the strong men of the rest of the world, the right Erdogans, the Putins, the Victor Auberts, the idea that there is a new model in the democratic world of strongman populist leaders who are standing in for the legislature, that the United States needs this as well. And the idea that he has mainly succeeded in the last 11 months by doing this so quickly, so forcefully, so dramatically, that is not going to be able to continue, right? And so how will the autocratic ambitions be transformed or modified in light of the, I think, growing resistance to a completely unilateral president that seems to be building in our institutions? And so, fourth question, how much of Trump's support reflected economic populism and aspirations, right? That the idea that when Donald Trump was president, inflation was low in, right, the first term. When, right, a successful businessman is put in the presidency, he creates the conditions for high levels of economic growth that benefit everyone, right? I do think, right, when Donald Trump says the reason he was elected was to reduce the price of groceries, he understands this very well. And so the idea that he was elected not to be a full-blown right-wing populist strongman, right, but to reduce the price of groceries and to increase the prospects for right employment on the part of the average American worker, that seems to me to be really instrumental to Trump's victory in 2024. And the economy is relatively weak. I'll show you data on this in a moment, but consumer confidence is absolutely tanking. And if it, in fact, tilts into a recession next year, I think there's a good likelihood that the rate of economic growth that we've seen over the last few years means that we're on our way to a recessionary period pretty soon. There does seem to be an awful lot of speculative investment in artificial intelligence and an economy being propped up really by one sector, right? The construction of data centers, the investment in artificial intelligence, crypto, and new technology. Well, if that can, right, if that's a bit of a bubble and it bursts, or if just the underlying job market continues to contract, if tariffs and deportation have the economic effects that I believe they will have, that we've talked about together before, how will Donald Trump's support hold up if the economy continues to weaken? Add to that if inflation remains stubborn, right? And so the affordability crisis continues to be exacerbated by increases in prices, will a substantial part of Donald Trump's base um, abandon him? And if so, how will Donald Trump react? Will there be more angry bluster and bullying, which seems to be the historical pattern how Donald Trump deals with defeats and setbacks? And I'll just say this very quickly. I do think that Donald Trump has led a career in which he has very often failed and yet very often managed to move on to the next enterprise, the next chapter of his life before that failure fully catches up with him. And it's maybe very hard, right? If it turns out the tariffs, the deportation policies, the aggressive use of executive action all backfire on Donald Trump, for Donald Trump to find the next thing that allows him to distract from those failures. But I think it's clear that that will be the policy and that we need to be thinking about, well, what will those distractions be? Will it be a showdown with Venezuela, or more efforts to increase the rate and the cruelty associated with the deportation campaign, more fights with other institutions? That these are the kinds of actions that Donald Trump has relied on in the past to distract from or eclipse previous failures. Fifth question: can the Republican MAGA coalition hold together in the absence of Trump's dominance and delivering the goods economically, right? And so I'll say more about this in a few minutes, but it does seem to me that Donald Trump, like any president, has assembled a diverse coalition to get elected, and that different elements of that coalition want very different things from him. When he is fully dominating, right, the institution of the presidency, I think it's more possible for him either to deliver the goods for each of those constituencies, or for those constituencies to be forced into line, even if they're not getting the treatment, the priority they think they deserve. But once Donald Trump's capacity to bully is no longer as great as it's been for the last year, will the coalition begin to fracture? Will elements begin to peel off? I think we're already seeing that. And how much more accelerated will that be? And what will its implications be for Donald Trump's capacity to rule? Shifting to the other side now, the next question I want to ask is about the Democrats, right? And not just the Democrats, but also civil society institutions and actors who are resisting Trump's presidency. And here, right, the question is always a two-horse race in American politics. It's not just how badly is Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again coalition doing. I mentioned this research to you, I think, a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to return to it, I think, next week. But there's some very interesting and I think, frankly, quite distressing research being done about the way in which the Democratic Party, the Democratic label, has become a drag on candidates who embrace it in many states in the United States. There's a growing perception, and at this point, it appears to have taken hold in a way that makes it hard to shake, that since the Bill Clinton era, and certainly through the Barack Obama presidency, the priorities of the Democratic Party are the priorities of well-educated, relatively elite, urban, cosmopolitan, globalist Americans, and not of the working class, the less well-educated, the rural, especially the white working class. And that this means that any candidate who runs in a election as a Democrat, right, under that banner, no matter how populist, no matter how egalitarian, no matter how convincing the policy platform they've assembled, they face a drag on their candidacy because of the kind of association that comes with being a Democrat in the United States in the 21st century. And so I think we need to be open, we need to be honest about that. I will just add very quickly, right, that I think part of Joe Biden's success in 2020 was that he appeared to be a return to the kind of Democratic candidate who didn't carry that baggage. He was Scranton Joe with a working class background. He was not particularly cosmopolitan. He hadn't gone to those elite institutions. He was kind of a bumbler who tripped over his words. And in certain respects, Americans actually respect and want that from their politicians. It makes them seem a little bit less elite, a little bit more approachable, someone who understands the situation of the average person or the person who is struggling in our society. But the fact that Joe Biden, in his last meaningful act as president, handed the baton of the party nomination to Kamala Harris, to someone who appeared to be like Barack Obama, but even worse, even more elite, even more globalist, even more cosmopolitan, I think really diminished the possibility of the Democrats overcoming this drag on their brand. And so having said that, right, the Democrats are going to have to field candidates who are strong enough to succeed in 2026 and 2028 in overcoming those liabilities. Let me add a second dimension to this, right? I think the most probably numerous and successful resistance to Donald Trump in his first year in office has come not from the Democratic Party, but from organizations like No Kings, the Resistance, the anti-ICE protesters. And there is a pattern here that we've spoken about together before, but it's been a little while, which is a pattern of resistance or protest politics being relatively easy to organize in the era of social media. You put the post up on Facebook, on Instagram, it goes and spreads virally via X, etc. And pretty soon you have large demonstrations, but they're relatively cost-free. You show up for the day of the demonstration. The stuff with ICE, I think, is actually not so cost-free, better organized, more like the model of the social movement politics of the 1960s and 1970s. But the question here is, can, right, this relatively easy, frictionless form of organizing give rise to the more difficult work of building institutional capacity that is necessary to win electoral campaigns. To win an election, you don't just come to one rally or two rallies on two different days. You have to do the hard work of canvassing, of getting out the vote. And this involves, right, sustained organizing at a neighborhood, at a precinct level. And it's unclear to me that the energy, which is anti-Trump energy right now, translates into pro-democratic candidate energy. If not, then it isn't clear that Donald Trump's diminished popularity and power actually opened the door for an alternative to Trump and his dominance in American politics. What are the most important remaining unaccomplished items on Trump's policy agenda? We'll start that pretty soon, but I think part of the question of how much success Donald Trump will have depends on how radical or ambitious his remaining agenda will be. Um, is a thwarted Trump more dangerous than the unilaterally empowered president of his first year? And first year of his second term, obviously. So I'll say this very, very quickly. Um, I certainly think that Donald Trump has been terrifying, right? Destructive, norm breaking. That he has been a serious threat to American democracy, that he's shown himself to be completely unrestrained in his willingness to use whatever power he can get his hands on. And obviously, there's a huge amount of power vested in the presidency, and he has, in fact, aggrandized that power by claiming unilateral control over executive agencies, by corrupting the Department of Justice and the FBI to be instruments of his will as opposed to instruments for the rule of law. And so I don't want to say that a diminished Trump is going to be worse, but I do want to say, right, that his actions may be redirected into policy domains that permit unilateral action. Right. And so foreign policy, we see this very often in second term presidencies in the United States, that the president turns to foreign policy because foreign policy does allow him to act unilaterally. Will we continue to pursue this aggressive policy against Venezuela? And I think it's worthwhile noting the connection with Cuba there as well. Will the United States begin to pursue an agenda of regime change in Europe? And please note that the national security strategy that we talked about last week outlines, right, the idea that the United States wants to actually support right-wing populism in France, in Germany, in Britain, in Italy, in other European countries as well. And this would be, I think, an area where Donald Trump might be able to continue to feel empowered, even if the capacity to bully the Republican Party or other institutions in the United States is diminished. I'm going to spend just a moment on the so-called affordability address that Donald Trump gave in the Poconos in Pennsylvania at the beginning of this week, right? And I got affordability address in scare quotes. This was meant to be, it was advertised as a policy address around the affordability issue. And the idea was that the president needed to indicate to the American people that he takes the idea of rising prices seriously and that he has policy tools that will allow him to address it. And this is in the aftermath of Donald Trump and the buildup to the off-term elections at the beginning of November, having called affordability a hoax, right? And he was supposed to avoid that language and trot out things to do about affordability. And if he did, well, he didn't avoid the language. He called affordability a hoax. But if he did trot out new ideas, they were drowned out by the lewd, sexist, racist tirade, some of the language against Somali Americans, right? These are mainly American citizens in Minnesota, completely detracted from his ability to reassert any control over the affordability narrative. But I want to return to a different idea. I'm not sure whether you remember the weave, right? This is something that Donald Trump talked about in 2024, where he said, look, people think I'm incoherent or off message, or that my rambling and my campaign addresses means that I'm unfocused, but actually there's an underlying genius and unity, real coherence camouflaged by apparent incoherence in my messaging. You just have to understand the way I weave ideas together. And the address in the Poconos was 92 minutes long. It did not adhere to the right confines, the method, the structure of a policy address. It appeared very much to be a completely incoherent campaign style rally. And this raises a question, right? Is this the way in which Donald Trump reacts to the pressure and the constraints of diminished power, by lashing out, by expressing anger, by revealing, right, what his wishes and desires are, as opposed to meeting the moment halfway, saying, okay, so Americans are not satisfied with the way my first 11 months in office have related to the affordability crisis. Let me see if I can match that, address that, figure out what to do to turn things around, as opposed to merely lashing out about it. I have on the board the stuff we look at on a frequent basis. I'm not going to dwell on this, right? The idea that Donald Trump has seen a sustained and nearly one-way decline in his popularity through his first year in office, and that this is allowing Republicans much greater latitude to defy his will, to continue to be associated closely with Donald Trump, to march in lockstep with him, as opposed to trying to open up some daylight between you and him, looks like an increasingly suicidal electoral strategy for Republicans, in light of the fact that Donald Trump is now, again, a deeply unpopular president. And he's unpopular across the full range of, issues that people associate him with. He's unpopular in immigration, tariffs, the economy, and inflation. But I want to point to one other thing here, and this is it seems to me, explanation for Donald Trump's unpopularity. And so I have on the board in the center top right the diagram that's been making the rounds recently of what's sometimes called a K-shaped economy, right? And the legs of the K are clearly indicated here. The red line is the stock market, the S&P 500, right? And how it's done in particular since 2020. But really, right, for a very long time, the stock market here has been increasing in value, reaching essentially record highs in November, December 2025. Does that translate into well-being for the rest of Americans? And we know that the people who own the stocks and benefit from the record highs in the stock market, primarily the top 10%, and basically the bottom 50% don't own any of these assets. The statistic I saw the other day that I just find stunning is, at this point, the three richest Americans, right, own more than the bottom 50% of America, right? And when we speak of the bottom 50%, the blue line indicates consumer confidence. And please note, right, that consumer confidence is at a near record low, despite the fact that the stock market is at a record high. And so the idea that there's a deep, deep chasm between the top and the middle slash bottom of our economy seems to me to be driving a lot of the disapproval. Donald Trump has been very good for the market. He's been very good for the wealthy and the affluent. He has not addressed the constituents who actually got him elected. And so, in thinking now in a little bit more concrete terms about how we should anticipate the next 3 years of Donald Trump's presidency, I think the first and maybe the fundamental question is how to understand his second term in office overall. What is its fundamental attribute and ambition? And so I'm going to go through three possible ways of looking at Trump and his ambition, his aspiration in his second term. The first would be to emphasize that Donald Trump is a would-be authoritarian who is exercising the autocrat's playbook very rapidly and very effectively. So he is a threat, and a new threat, a radical departure from American politics. Yes, some of his policies draw on long-standing Republican themes, but the way in which he's implementing those policies make him a fundamental threat to American institutions and democracies. And if this is accurate, then this is a genuine emergency, and resistance and containment focusing our politics really on saying we have to do everything possible to prevent Donald Trump from further consolidating power. But then we also have to recognize, right, that our institutions open themselves to this threat due to their own long-standing problems, and pursue an agenda not only of containing and resisting Donald Trump's authoritarian play, but also reforming our institutions so that the demand for a future authoritarian is addressed and ultimately diffused. The idea that the only strategy here is to win every election, that the Republican Party is going to remain a Make America Great Again, a populist, a strongman party, and that the only way to keep it from destroying the rule of law, democratic government, respect for the opposition, rights for minorities within our society is just to always beat it back, to either defeat it or immediately win the next election to check whatever the next iteration of MAGA is, doesn't seem like a very stable approach. And so one of the questions here is, should this be the main priority of the Democrats in 2026 and 2028? That depends on this interpretation of Donald Trump and what he represents. A second interpretation would be, really, no, Donald Trump is not that new and not that different. He's more coarse, he's more crude, he's more radical and more unilateral in the way that he pursues what is an essentially long-standing Republican agenda that goes back at least to Ronald Reagan, and in fact brings out essential elements in American democracy. We have been long-term a plutocratic society ruled by the rich. We have long-standing racism. It's just been maybe a little bit muzzled in the last 20 years, but now it's back, loudly proclaimed from the bully pulpit of the presidency again. We've had these anti-democratic tendencies in our politics for a long time, but we now are seeing them fully expressed by a disinhibited president. And if this interpretation is correct, then this is not an emergency, This is where half of America is, and we're going to have to figure out how to either change their minds or how to use the institutions that we have to continue to pursue our goals in our jurisdictions, the areas where the blue Democratic Progressive coalition still remains in power. The third interpretation of Donald Trump is that this is a transformative presidency, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, like Abraham Lincoln. Donald Trump is running up against the constraints of American constitutional democracy, and in particular of the rigidity of our Constitution that doesn't allow it to change, right? And so Abraham Lincoln and the radical Republicans had to amend the Constitution by excluding the Southern Rebellion states from power in order to abolish slavery and to try to create a society that allowed equal rights for the formerly enslaved, right? FDR, right, had to run headlong against the Supreme Court again and again and again to eventually expand the power of the federal government to regulate the economy and counteract the Depression. And both FDR and Lincoln had to smash norms, restructure institutions and routines in order to renew American government. Is Donald Trump, right, despite the fact that he is repellent, grotesque in his priorities, actually doing what American politics needs? It needs effective energy to meet the demands of the 21st century, the slowness of congressional action, the right inertia built into our bicameral system and the rules of both the House and the Senate have made it such that we are no longer able to secure a responsive government through American institutions. And so if that interpretation is accurate, will, if the Democrats regain control of the presidency, will they want to avail themselves of some of Trump's tactics? Will they want to have greater, right, unilateral action issuing from the presidency? If that's the right reading of this, then this is not a constitutional crisis, despite the fact that we deeply disagree with Donald Trump's policy priorities. And so getting straight about what Donald Trump is trying to do and how much of a threat he represents, I think is extraordinarily important to figuring out how we want to frame the next 3 years, how we want to frame our priorities as we enter the next electoral cycle. So I'll stop there. This is the beginning, like I say, of an effort to really anticipate what the coming year and years will be like. I'm obviously not all the way there. Part of the next phase in this is to look at the elements of Donald Trump's coalition, and if it's going to start to fracture, which I think we're already seeing, which elements will Donald Trump cater to? Will he feel that either politically he has to do the work to keep them on board, or ideologically and dispositionally, this is where his true sympathies lie, and so he's just going to double down on his support for the white nationalists or the Christian nationalists or the politics of grievance, even if it means getting in the way of the affordability agenda. I think that's where we go next. But I've used my time for today. Want to hear your questions or thoughts. Who wants to start us out? What did I leave out? What are you thinking about as you think about the transition into the second year of the Trump presidency? Rose, go ahead. It looks like you're unmuted.
Okay. A few days ago, Robert Reich sent around an amazing video that addressed Trump's significant mental decline. And he said it was one thing to talk about it, another thing to see it. And he pointed out that
Right.
that Trump is being manipulated by Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, RFK Jr., and others, for their own financial gains and their own, to increase their own power. And, it seems like these people are really running the government now. And I'd like you to talk about that.
Well, I haven't seen the Robert Reich video. I've seen some of what he's posted in social media before. There are other people who are interested in pursuing this line. Heather Cox Richardson, for instance, has written some about this as well. And I have to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not a clinical psychiatrist or psychologist. And by the way, responsible psychologists and psychiatrists will tell you they need to be in the room and to actually be able to do diagnostic tests on someone to determine whether they're suffering from some kind of dementia or diminishment of their mental capacities with age. I'm just not sure about this, Rose. And so
No.
having said that, it certainly wouldn't be the first time that a president has declined in office, right? And by the way, it might be earlier, although there are arguments about when Ronald Reagan's dementia
Mhm.
began to set in when he was in office. Um, but I do think, um, and I'll just say this very quickly, Donald Trump appears to be competent some of the time, right? And quite cogent and quite lucid some of the time. And so I don't know. I'm not inclined to think that I am just going to say that Donald Trump is now being manipulated by the people around him. I think that there's a sense in which he chose those people. And as far as I can tell, they're still doing more or less what he wanted them to do. So I will um, point out, and I do think it is absolutely clear that the MAGA movement is anticipating that Donald Trump's reign is coming to an end, and they are jockeying to determine who will succeed him. And that one of the strategies, and here I'd point to Marjorie Taylor Greene or to Tucker Carlson, is to begin to really turn on Trump and criticize him. Right. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that, that Donald Trump is no longer going to be the clear head of the movement. He may be brought into the Republican Party and transform the Republican Party by bringing it into it, not only because his energy, his stamina, and perhaps his command are diminished. And the first two, I think it's absolutely clear, right? And we all know this. You don't maintain the same level of energy in your 80s that you had in your 60s, right? But having said that, let alone in your 30s, right? So having said that, I think the way I would reframe your question, Rose, until I have enough evidence, is Donald Trump going to have the energy, the capacity, the wherewithal to manage his cabinet as, right, more people start to look to the post-Trump era? Is he going to have the capacity to hold his party together? And here I'm suggesting I don't think he will, and that may not have anything to do with his right capacity as a man. It may have much more to do with the political and power dynamics within the Republican Party in the country. But Rose, I will look at that video, and
Please look at it.
yeah,
Please
I'll
look at
see what I think, and it's
it.
something that I think as time goes by, we're probably going to spend more time thinking about.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rose. Anybody else? So, Flossie, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, and then I see you also, Sandy. So you can go next. Flossie, you're still muted. Still, so you got to hold down, keep the space bar held down. Anybody close to Flossie? No. You had
I'm
it.
worried.
Now you have it. Go ahead.
I'm worried about how many of our young thinking people get their information from sources like, well, not only Facebook, but they go to the artificial intelligence people and have them write their papers, and the profs accept the papers, and the the thinking is so puerile, but this is what is happening. Something called AI is directing a lot of our intellectual activity. I see it among my young friends, and it's scary. The
Yeah.
thinking that we had to do on our own might have had problems, but AI, the Apple people, now very big, are doing a lot of our thinking. So many of my friends don't even write their own letters.
Yeah, certainly not their own emails, and it's a little hard to resist when Gmail proposes the composed email, which isn't the way you would have written it, but says what you were supposed, basically the gist of what you were going to say. But I think in particular, Flossie, reading is as you were mentioning, right? And I deal with this. I'm teaching college right now, right? And I teach in a way that I've been teaching mainly for a long time. And my field involves reading long, difficult treatises, right? And I'm finding students it's a mixed bag, and I still have some really good students, but there is a diminished attention, right? When students, instead of reading long books, are watching short videos that are totally fragmentary. It goes from one thing to another thing to another thing because that's the way the algorithm holds their attention on the screen. Yes, I do think, and by the way, right, as our capacity to read diminishes, our capacity for sustained thinking and for deliberation, for understanding things from multiple perspectives, for sympathetically right, actually responding to each other also diminishes. And that's obviously unhealthy for democracy. And yes, I'm focused right now on Trump's changed grasp on power, but these are deeper issues that we also need to return to. Sandy and then John. Sandy, go ahead because I saw you first.
Last night, Rachel Maddow was in Chicago with Timothy Snyder celebrating the success of Chicago driving out ICE.
Yeah.
And one of the things they talked about that happens with autocracies is that the ICE type forces connect with local police and form resistance and form the ability to conquer, and that's probably what's happening every time ICE goes into a city if the local police cooperate with ICE.
Yeah, interesting. And I don't know that I've got much to add to that, Sandy. But yes, the idea that and please note, right, that ICE seems to be moving to friendlier jurisdictions as it is thwarted in places like Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, Portland, right? And as the courts are increasingly skeptical of its tactics, of the legality or constitutionality of the way in which it's imposing order, it wants to move to places where it's less likely to be caught up in courts. So yeah, I do think that in a sense, it took 6 months, but that the blue city, the sanctuary city, the places where the local government is or the state government not inclined to cooperate with ICE are going to become more and more difficult for ICE to conduct operations in. Yeah, thank you, Sandy. John, go ahead. Haven't heard from you for a little while.
That's true, and I only have a trivial footnote, but it is true that college students obviously are increasingly using ChatGPT and AI to write their papers. But the saving grace for professors is that now we can grade them with AI too. So, it's a big time saver.
No, that's not the only saving grace. The grammar from the AI is much better than the
Way
grammar.
better, no question
Yeah,
about
yeah. So no. I will tell you, I would say maybe 10% of my papers, I suspect that AI has had a hand in it. And I am uh, probably, if I don't, if I can't get the better of myself, because I really shouldn't, but I'm probably going to be on the AI and education panel or task force that Sarah Lawrence is assembling. A bunch of people are encouraging me to be on this panel. I obviously do some thinking and teaching about the ethics of the use of technology. So the idea that in my own practice as a teacher, rather than trying to police this, right? Which I think a lot of my colleagues are doing, and by the way, one thing that AI is really good at is figuring out whether AI was used to write a paper, right? So it's pretty easy at this point to figure it out. But I'm trying to model, right, the value of not using AI, then and the intrinsic pleasures that come with thinking through hard problems for yourself, as well as the advantages for life in developing that capacity, right? If you're a student at a college or a university, somebody's giving you 4 years to develop your problem solving capacities. And if you spend those 4 years playing video games and letting AI read your books and write your papers for you, then you're going to come out a really good video game player and probably not very well equipped to manage the most important decisions in your life. And by the way, this whole range of pleasures, the pleasures of the mind, the pleasures of the intellect, the pleasures that come from making meaning and understanding the great works of art and culture and civilization, well, you had 4 years to acquire that, and instead you got really good at first person shooter games, right? Yeah, I'm trying to work on selling the liberal arts to the students at my liberal arts college. Hannah, go ahead.
The part that I object or worry about is where does the human fit into this then? Why have this stumbling human? Uh, and doesn't that take away most of the purpose and pleasures of our lives as intellectual human beings?
So you say that the stumbling human being. I'm going to share something with you from my dinner last night. We went out to celebrate a birthday with friends to a restaurant, and one of the friends has just come through a rather difficult breakup, and they were giving their narrative of the breakup, and I won't go into the details, but the other friend pushed back and said, "Oh, come on, you got to be honest with us. This isn't, you're not all victim in this scenario. You played your share." And you know, AI, in the way in which it's engineered right now, is designed to make you happy, designed not to give you any pushback or any friction. And so, one of the things a good friend does is not get let you get away with, telling a half truth that totally absolves you of your responsibility for something falling apart when you have responsibility for it. And so yeah, I worry it's not just that AI is going to be smooth and easy, and I'll be honest with you, I use it occasionally and it has incredible and growing capacity. So among the things I did last night, I was in a friend's car that is self-driven. And it's been a couple years since I was in a self-driven car, and it is so much better than it was. It's really phenomenally good. And the friend said to me he basically doesn't drive anymore. That he gets in his car in New York City, in Manhattan, in hard to navigate areas, and he pushes the button to go to work, which is outside of New York City, and then he opens a book because he trusts
Wow.
his car to drive itself. That's a different world. And I got another friend, I think I mentioned, who works in law for one of the big tech companies, and the word came down from on high. We want to see if we can avoid hiring new lawyers. Let's see how much of the work that used to be done by the early career lawyers can be done by AI. And he told me the other day that he thinks that AI is better than the average new hired lawyer, right? And so this is not what we're talking about today, really, I don't think. But having said that, the idea that this technology is growing very quickly in its capacities to do a whole range of things that humans used to be the only creatures on the planet that were capable of doing, whether that's writing legal briefs or driving cars, I think we have to get our heads around. The idea that the fact that it's really good at doing this stuff does not mean it's thinking, does not mean it has a mind, right? And so the idea that you can have intelligence without having a mind is a little tricky. But uh, in the same way that your um, calculator is much better than you are at long division, right? But you wouldn't say your calculator has a mind of its own. I think we're getting to this world where artificial intelligence is going to be better at driving. And please note, right, in the world in which artificial intelligence is driving all our cars, if the predictions are right, we will save hundreds of thousands of lives a year because, right, people will not have as high a level of accidents. And there will be real advantages to this, but that doesn't mean this is a technology with consciousness or with a mind. And so getting straight about that, and that therefore, despite the fact that it might be very good at talking with you and flattering you, it's not really a friend. Yeah. Thank you for the comment, Hannah. I can see I'm pushing buttons. We need to go back to talking about AI. So I think it's Sarah Hendrickson and then John Campbell. Sarah, do I have your name right?
Yes, that's right, John.
Sorry, you've got a bunch of numbers and no
Yes,
S at the beginning.
right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. Have we reached the point where you can submit a document to AI for feedback,
Oh,
critical feedback?
absolutely,
That's
absolutely.
easy.
And so let me tell you a little bit about my test driving AI the other day. There's a book I've read that I was getting ready to give a lecture on, and I wanted to just experiment with this. So I asked Gemini, which is Google's big chatbot or large language model artificial intelligence program, to write a report on the book for me that summarized its central arguments. And I got a 10-page document, and it was thorough and accurate and had diagrams to organize the claims. It is very powerful at this point. So absolutely yes. John, go ahead. Maybe last
Thank you.
word for today.
From a professor's point of view, you can fight back against AI by having all your writing by students done in class in blue books, but the price of that is you have to read their handwriting, which is maybe more than you can tolerate.
Yeah, I'm certainly not doing that, and I do have to say, it's not just it's a funny observation, right? I mean, but it's actually true. It's painful, but that what you want students to do is not only do exams, right? You want them to write papers. It
Oh,
actually does something different intellectually, and so I have colleagues who are writing papers with tricks that are known to fool AI and that the sloppy student doesn't notice. When I say that they're assigning essays that have these tricks built into them. And I have colleagues who are spending a lot of time policing their papers to try to see if they're written by AI. I'm like I say, trying to take a different tact. I don't know if I'm going to succeed or if I'm going to lose this battle. I don't know. The old literature you guys may be familiar with, that the paperback book is going to ruin civilization because it's going to make everybody do pulp fiction or write to the lowest common denominator. Obviously, that technology didn't actually ruin our civilization, I don't believe. But yes, there is a kind of techno alarmism that very often each generation has about the new technology. I do think this is different in kind, and that we're not just being alarmist, and that we're going to have to figure out how to limit it, how to regulate it, how to use it as well, responsibly, ethically, but also humanistically, and that those are going to be big challenges for the coming decades. All right, guys. Lovely conversation today. I particularly liked the way we went in the question and answers, which took us a little bit away from the rather depressing topic of American politics. More to come. Be well. See everybody next week. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.